support systems like La Leche League, or in there's a huge host of what that might be, and that as hackers, maybe we need to go to those organizations and what you were saying, pull from the work of what is being done there and define that as our hacker work or include it, you know.
So we've got very little time left. I'd like to hear from someone who hasn't spoken yet. So yeah, go.
I want to know your opinion on how to promote the empowerment of women in biotechnology, biohacking, and well, science in general. I've discussed many times on which is the appropriate model to do this. Do we really need to design specific courses for women on biohacking, or we can use the same structure as any other course on biotech? Because there is an initiative in Mexico that promotes courses for women on STEM topics, but exclusively for women. So is segregation the best strategy, or do we must do this as gender equity? I mean, involving men and women.
I have a strong opinion on that. So I used to run an organization called Science Club for Girls, and the exploratory now is also primarily a majority for girls. And I'm all for spaces where men and women can participate at the same time. However, until we're actually conscientiously creating an environment and a culture where women and girls actually feel welcome, for the most part, when they enter those spaces, what they get is rejection and hostility, even though it may not be conscious. And so I think there's we run our exploratory and saying, you know what, it's primarily open for girls, but boys are welcome. And in those women and girls only spaces, we're giving the women and the girls the
the
confidence.
microphone has some issue again. I cannot.
Yeah.
So something is feedbacking.
That they gain the confidence first. And for us now, that as we're including boys as well as men who are teachers, we actually discuss with them, and as well as female teachers as well, we have conversations around gender equity, so that it's not something that kind of like implied, but like everybody examining their own unconscious biases and actively creating those spaces.
Yeah. That's exactly my experience. Yeah.
Going off of what Carolyn said, I think that, thanks. I think that if you want to get young girls, women more involved, I think that it's, I don't know if classes and courses need to be tailored towards like how women think, and I think just to acknowledge that what their mothers are doing, what their grandmothers are doing is already considered a form of biohacking that's much more powerful and rooted in culture and tradition. I think acknowledging that is a way to bring more women into the space.
Does anybody else want to add anything on that topic? I guess I'd just say it's that there's a lot of material, and maybe there's a lot of material on this. This is in some ways a solved problem. We've been working on this for too long. Yeah. So you know.
Still talking about this.
But I guess another thing, yeah. So it's absolutely fair question. There's lots of stuff that can help. Another thing is female founders. If you have female founders, women founders, women non-binary, people who are running your spaces, that brings people in. That's one of the top kind of proved methods as far as I'm aware. Did you want to? This is your area too. Did you want to?
Well, I've spoken a lot, so
Did you want to add anything?
Okay. Well, there were so many interesting topics right now, so my head is a bit like twisted, so I can't really answer directly to one thing. But I think, like from what I like this symbiosis in my head I got from that is like I think biohacking can be a really powerful tool for women who don't have access to a lot of knowledge and education in order to make them understand how their bodies work and even provide them with protocols, for example, how they can hack their own hormones or stuff like this, or how they can like change the milk they produce or whatever, or like like do all this nice stuff for themselves in order to understand them and get power by that. So they're not dependent on the outside, but they can learn it somewhere from some internet protocol and then get a bit more power by that. So that was just, I didn't know if you were saying that before, but that's what just popped up to my head.
Yeah, just each vagina has its own biome and a fingerprint, you know? That's profound.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. It's wonderful. Hi. It's been wonderful to have you with us. We really appreciate it. And thank you so much for a great discussion. Yeah.
Can you maybe collect email addresses of people who want to stay in touch? Because I really would like to continue the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Take care. Bye.
Yeah, we can put it in the notes, maybe.
Yeah, well, we just didn't have time.
Okay. All right, because
All right, everybody, let's do some report backs. Which group is ready to go first? Report backs.
Did you want to report back, or do you want me to? I don't even know how to just summarize this discussion.
Let's go, let's go, let's go. Time is a wasting. Okay, Allison.
Kia ora, we had a wonderful conversation on feminist perspectives in biotechnology. And I can't even think of how to summarize our discussions, but we talked about non-Western models of creating space and community and maintaining space and community, inequality, value of women's work, getting paid, female founders, how to encourage more women in biotech. We will be forming a group with Stephanie. Come and talk to us. There's a lot of experts in this group who are happy to keep the conversation going. Thank you.
Yes, awesome. Up next. Oh, I'm sorry. Before you, just say the session that you're in before you start.
The session was a definition about biohacking. And I'm Minerva, and I'm sorry, yesterday I don't show up in the Hello World, but now I'm here to tell about the definition we described in the session. And Maria told us about 4 core areas that are grinders, related to functional body modifications, quantified cells that consist that we can quantify our cells, synthetic biology to apply the tools, and also math science. And our purpose was to change the bad perception of the public perception to feel represented by projects, the kind of projects that you are doing. So we are planning to have a brainstorm of possibility definitions and sent by a committee to the Oxford Dictionary to change the definition about biohacking.
Yes, and additionally, other things that we can do is to make sure that there's people not just inside to maintain a constant dialogue with the public, but also on the outside too. To have people on the outside jump into parts of biohacking that people normally don't think about. For example, take someone like The Rock or some other celebrity, sprucing up their coffee and identifying. That would have a tremendous impact for the definition how the public perceive it. We must take extra means to control the narrative, and we can do this very well and very efficiently.
Thanks.
Okay, and we got an update on the BioNet.
All right, so we at the BioBricks Foundation, I work for them, pretty much discussed our progress on open source DNA and how that is going. And the goal of the BioNet project is to be able to have open source DNA for all of you. So we explained how we're integrating software, so a software side of decentralized interconnected nodes of people sharing the sequence and what inventory they have with law and the lawware side, where we have made open MTAs, and MTAs that really allow you to share and use the plasmids and DNA and strains you get freely, and then finally the wetware side of the physical DNA molecules that you can get and use for free. And so we discussed the integration of all of those, and we think we're really making headway, and we'd love for you guys to join us.
And we have Angela from Boss Lab. Which session?
We discussed the future of biohacking 5, 10 to 20 years from now. And we started out by talking about what aspirations we have for our individual labs. And I think there was a common theme in that we all want to stay connected with the community, but that also we want to become recognized as serious organizations. And so some of the things that we talked about was we'd like to see some of these community labs and biohackers potentially publishing in journals, open access journals, or engaging with policy. So like really getting that recognition. But also the other thing that we discussed is that we don't want to become academia. And so we also discuss strategies for basically maintaining our identity as kind of a grassroots DIY bioscience organization community. And another thing that we discussed is that we want more collaborations. We want to stay connected with each other, and so we need more of that and more conferences like this one. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. And I hope you talked about PubPub also, open source publishing system that Travis presented. So that's a good tie-in. Okay, thank you. And Eleanor, bring us home.
So this was the session on how to empower and scale up health innovation in DIY bio. We were kind of trying to understand why there is so few work, on specific health innovation in this ecosystem, and we kind of defined that notion of a chill factor. So can you go beyond probiotics and diagnostic areas that are just unregulated right now? Can you work on treatments? Can you go further? And one of the main idea we came up with was, how does risk assessment look like in a DIY ecosystem? So how can we adapt that for this specific ecosystem? Can we think about reproducibility? For example, can we have a collective platform for tracking, what health innovation is working, how we can collectively improve it? So that was kind of, the idea. How do we develop risk assessment for that? And how we create a form of collective intelligence in that new DIY assessment.
Okay, thank you so much, Eleanor. And thanks to you all for a great set of morning unconferences. I know that when we were planning today, the original plan actually was to start at noon, recognizing that after a crazy party last night, people will probably need some time to recover. But the unconference wall was so lovingly filled, 9 a.m. sharp, all these great unconferences. And we got here at like 8:30, and it was like me and Portia, the yoga person. We were like, okay, I think we might have to start a little bit later. But glad to see you've all woken up and you are all here. Really, really excited I'll have you for this next session with George. But before we do that, just a couple of quick things. One, I want to specifically acknowledge Elliot and Xavier, wherever you guys are. You guys stayed until the very, very end of the party, and you helped clean up. So please, shout outs to Elliot and to Xavier. Thank you very, very much. Yes. And actually, was there anybody else that stayed until the end to help clean up as well? I know there were a couple. I was asking. I wanted to find out who exactly the people were, because it's not that party is a totally student and Media Lab run party, so it's not like there's janitorial staff that comes after. It's all of us cleaning up together. So I just really, really wanted to acknowledge you two because I knew that you stayed. But anybody else that did, we are all thanking you in spirit right now. So really, really appreciate that. Okay, so that was one point. Another point. So You know, something that happened a lot yesterday, and I think a lot of you may have been experiencing this as well. I had so many just amazing, amazing conversations with you where, you know, somebody would grab me aside and just say, hey, you know, this conference has meant to me X. I've really been experiencing Y. I'm gonna bring back to me in my home lab Z. And I've had so many of those great moments last night at the party and throughout the day. And I was just thinking to myself, you know, we've got all of these film crews and all these people shooting, and I was like, God, I wish somebody had captured that because it was such a beautiful moment. And, you know, we have all these great people that are shooting here today. And so Tina and Mary, who are, where are Tina and Mary? Oh, they're over here. Okay, so Mary and Tina are all-star docu team. Yeah, round of applause for Tina and Mary, yep. So, so what Tina and Mary are going to do throughout the day-to-day, I mean, they're capturing and shooting the whole day-to-day, of course, as well. But if at any point, and if you've been processing and think to yourselves that you have certain reflections and things that you really, really want to share, go find Tina or Mary and just grab them for a couple of minutes, and they'll just capture you sharing whatever you want to share. It could be a reflection, it could be an appreciation, whatever you'd like, they're there for you, and they will capture it for you, okay? So it'll be something that we can document and share. So please do that. And then finally, we also have a guest book at the info desk. Please sign the guest book, write us a note. We would love to have that. And yeah, I think that's basically it, okay? So reflections on camera with these two, and then also some signing our guest book. And so Peter, maybe we can get the first slide. Okay, so this next part of the Bio Summit, I'm really, really excited about. When we first decided to do the Bio Summit, you know, however many months ago, the first person that I was like, we got to get here is George. So, you know, I worked and found, you know, George's amazing assistant Emma, and we're like, all right, we got to get George for Bio Summit. And George, you know, of course, has been such a gracious, amazing person. I just have to say, George, really, like, I've asked George to do some really strange, random things, like, hey, George, can you show up at our community lab and wear this specific outfit, and we're going to film you for 15 minutes talking about this thing and holding this object? And George is just like, yeah, sure, I'll do that. And so, I mean, literally every request I've ever asked of George, he's said yes and done. And so, yeah, George, you're just such an amazing, wonderful human being. And this is a photograph of George teaching how to grow almost anything. Oh, I see Neil Groschenfurter, so hello, Neil, sorry. And yeah, so this is George lecturing as part of How to Grow Almost Anything at EMW, our community lab. And let's see, clicker, advance, there we go. So this is George as part of the course, and we talked about that yesterday. There's a little lag on the button. I am clicking right. Nothing is happening. Okay, so lovely smiling picture of George. This is my like George Church kind of joke deck, I guess. So this is Charles Darwin, and this is George teaches this class, Darwin on Steroids, Biodesign, Diversity, and Selection. He actually just gave that lecture last week. And then you know, this is George. So George is kind of like, you know, the chiral Charles Darwin. And again, you know, I showed George this picture, and I was like, hey, George, can I take a funny picture of you doing this? And he's like, yeah, sure. So, George, you should be careful. You should, you know, because it's going to get you in trouble sometime if you just keep saying yes to everybody. But George, again, such a lovely person. And what is next? Oh, yeah, so this is, again, George, you know, just testing out some of the equipment. You know, over the summer, as part of How to Grow Almost Anything, our lab was building a lot of DIY tools, and we were able to share some of these with George and have him play with them and test them. And just in conclusion, so this is a photograph that I took of George at the March for Science in Boston. And you know, George gave an amazing speech there. And so for those of you who don't know, George is the subject of a new book that just came out called Woolly, written by a wonderful author, Ben Mesrek, who's written some really, really wonderful books. So he wrote the book Bringing Down the House about the MIT Blackjack Club, which just got turned into the huge movie 21. He also wrote the book, The Accidental Billionaires, which got turned into the movie The Social Network. So Ben basically kind of writes these books that get turned into these major blockbuster movies. And so they've written this book, Woolly, about George and his lab's efforts to de-extinct the woolly mammoth. Okay, and so Fox is doing this huge, I don't know how many, like billion-dollar movie about George, and they're looking for different actors to play George. So I think George, they haven't finalized the actor quite yet, but I think there are a couple that are in consideration, and this is very real. These are the consideration. So Jeff Bridges is one of the people that is being considered to play George in this film. So Jeff, I think, would be really, really good. He's got the classic George Church twinkle in the eye and the mischievous, you know, kind of thing that George has got. The other key person that I think would also be really, really good, and they're very seriously considering this person, is Tom Hanks. Okay, so Castaway Tom Hanks I think is the other really potentially awesome George Church in this movie. And I'm being totally serious. This movie they're casting it now. It's going to be shot next year, and it's going to come out, and it's going to be a massive, massive film. And so George is, obviously he's a really, really amazing member of our community, not just the DIY bio community, but the broader SynBio community and biotechnology community. And he's about to be, kind of, and appropriately so, put out to the larger global consciousness as well. So it's such an honor to have George here to join and hang out at BioSummit and hang out and talk with you all. So everybody, please join me in welcoming George Church. Okay, so yeah, have a seat, George. So we're gonna keep this pretty chill. I just have like a couple of quick questions, and then we're basically just gonna open it up to everybody to hang out and talk and chat with you. So, just to start, I mean, one thing, as we've gotten to know each other over the years, one thing I really, really love about you and your whole energy, I think you're totally a biohacker at heart. You know, we've hung out in your office and in a lot of planning around how to grow almost anything in the Bioacademy. You know, one thing you've said to me a lot is, we'll talk about kind of different elements we're trying to do for the class, and you'll say like, well, oh, that's so easy. All you need is a centrifuge. Like, why do you need anything more than that to do self-free, DNA work, right? You can just spin it down. All you need is a centrifuge. Or you'll kind of identify a complex process and then pick out a couple of tools and say, oh yeah, this is all you need. Like, we don't need anything more than that. We can just do this very, very simply. And we've talked about some of your graduate students and how many of them are very, very trained and have a lot of experience, but a lot of them may not have that kind of hacker spirit to be able to just figure out an experiment and find the simplest way to do it. And so something that, again, I've always really admired about you is that kind of core hacker ethic that you have. And so I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about, your own experiences with, quote unquote biohacking, and maybe some of your experiences with this community, because you've known so many of the folks that are involved in this community for many years.
Yeah, right. I probably didn't just say centrifuge, probably said Dremel centrifuge, a drill bit. I mean, I think I started obsessing about both natural and very unnatural biology when I was around 10 years old. I was grafting things in my backyard and messing around with mud flats, growing frogs that got thyroid treatments and Venus flytraps that were getting gibberellin treatment to try to make them big. Didn't work, fortunately. But fast forward to Personal Genome Project, I think is a example of citizen science that encourages hacking, knowing your genome, because it could really help you and your family. And then Jason Bobe was one of the first people I recruited into the Personal Genome Project. He's been an absolutely wonderful mensch in that community. And about the same time we were starting that, we also got interested in BioWeatherMap and DIY Bio in Boston. And I think that was a fundamental breakthrough for me personally to see that kind of thing happening. I was at BioCurious on day 1 or 2 that they opened up, and I've had pleasure of watching GenSpace from the beginning as well. So, but these are just organizational components. What's more important is the kind of the zeitgeist that spreads through in ways that are mysterious. And I think the attitude, we produced one of the first open source sequencing hardware. I think still maybe the only open source hardware in that category. Supporting things like Wikipedia, Personal Genome Project, essentially the Wikipedia of human biology. The attitude that you can reuse this any way you want. We're not going to micromanage how you're going to use it, how the cells that come out of Personal Genome Project, or you can do them however you want. If you want to do something commercial with them, that's fine. We're nonprofit, but you can do whatever you want. And I think that's important because a lot of the academic licenses, if you can get them at all, have some kind of anti-commercial clause in them. So anyway, that's a broad overview.
No, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. And so, again, I think one of the, real interesting themes that's emerged for us over the past couple of days of this conference, so Joey Ito, when he gave the opening talk, he asked us a question. The title of his talk was, "Are we a movement yet?" That was his question, are we a movement yet? Yesterday, we had Marshall Gans join us from DC, and he gave a really, really moving talk kind of thinking about and different types of movements that he had been a part of, you know, working with Cesar Chavez and kind of labor organizers there, also the Obama campaign and so on. And so I'm wondering, you know, again, you've been a part of so many technological movements and major scientific discoveries. And so, you know, I guess I'm wondering your thoughts and your opinions about movements in science and movements in technology, and maybe how this community connects with some of those ideas.
Yeah, right. So certainly, very young, I got interested in movements like Earth Day in 1970 and Zero Population Growth ZPG. More recently, you showed the March for Science. I think it's very important that we all have the ability to think critically and have those criticisms satisfied, not have them open-ended only. You know.
Well, I guess maybe more if you can comment, because I think, you know, what's interesting about this particular group is, you know, we've got this distributed global network of laboratories. You know, academic research is also distributed laboratories interacting. But, you know, it feels like there's something fundamentally different about this type of community where there is a lot of active public engagement, and sort of the capacity to scale, I think, is different than what happens in academic research, where, again, it's pretty clustered in a smaller group. And so I'm wondering if there's anything in your experience or that you've thought of that kind of connects a little bit more with what we're doing here.
Yeah, well, certainly, you know, I was involved in the internet, you know, using it since '68 when it was just nothing. And it was very disappointing in a certain sense until sort of mid-'90s, where people, early adopters, started talking about it, using it. It transitioned into something that could have commercial components, although that wasn't the heart and soul of it. But that's an example of a transition where you have kind of a shared vision, or not even a well-articulated one, but it's more of it's in the wind sort of thing. I think that's exactly how this feels today, is that we have a movement where people are seeing all the different components of it and how it applies to our lives. You know, your personal genome could save your life. You should all have access to it. It's almost a birthright that you should know what's going on there. If you're going to be hacking, you should know what you're hacking.
Right. Absolutely, I agree with that. And I guess you know, just to wrap up before and just to open it up for the audience. You know, I think this particular community, you know, where you know, one of the things that I'm personally very excited about is kind of imagining the potential of like what we might be able to collectively achieve together. And I'm wondering if you might be able to comment a little bit about, you know, what the potential of this community could be in a few different areas. So, you know, one of them, and again, this is sort of kind of connected with different aspects of the program over the course of the past couple of days. You know, obviously innovation is a very big one. You've been involved in a lot of really, you know, kind of critical technologies, CRISPR and major sequencing tools and so on. And so, you know, what do you think, you know, what are the prospects of us and this kind of larger network of laboratories, you know, being involved in contributing to a major type of technological development like that?
Yeah, I think it's easy to be dismissive or be dismissed in this case, but I think that's very likely to be short-sighted in this case, because the contribution can be, first of all, people in this room are the most likely ones to translate to everybody else in the world that how impactful this is to everyday people. This goes beyond just hobbies like gardening and astronomy. This is really is the internet is the correct metaphor or more. But that's one thing. But also there's collection to be done. So out there in the world, things like CRISPR were not really invented. I mean, there were inventions that made it a good technology, but it is so sophisticated that if you had to invent that from scratch, it would be very challenging. I think even you'd have to cheat somehow. And the same thing goes for, there's also a lot to be harvested and harnessed from our human diversity. There's a lot of people out there that are unusual, in fact, probably some of you, where there are people in the world that are resistant to HIV, for example. There are people that are resistant to coronary artery disease. I mean, completely, there's no way they're going to die of either of those diseases. And the list goes on. And by sharing your self-knowledge, and no scientist knows more about you than you do, at least until you start sharing, it could improve it for everybody else. So this whole idea of we are each sentinels for things that are happening. If there's an emerging pathogen, this community is the most likely one to develop the cheap, scalable diagnostics that would detect those before anybody else saw them.
So on that specific point, you know, again, one question I've asked you in the past is, you know, what do you think are some of the types of problems that this network of laboratories would be well equipped to solve? And that particular one you mentioned, low-cost diagnostics, being able to get kind of distributed data, real-time data about infectious disease and so on. It seemed like a really amazing one. But what are the other types of things that, you know, again, this network of laboratories, if we could develop the types of infrastructure to share data, detect things and so on, like what types of global problems might we be poised to help address?
Well, like I said, Jason and I were highly motivated by the bioweather map concept. Is if you report that that the allergens or the pathogens in your community, in your immediate environment, that is something that can have a ripple effect. The more people that share, the more impactful it is, and that can be. That's scalable. I would love that everybody had a wearable sequencer, so that or some equivalent thing that maybe something you can make and distribute to all your friends, and then that becomes part of the internet. That's part of the Internet of Things. Is it's telling you what's in the food, water, and air at that point, 24/7. But it goes far beyond that. I mean, you can be involved in archival storage of media. You could come up with a leaf that records video, and then those leaves could be everywhere, with all positive and negative aspects of that. And the same thing goes for, you know, almost everything that you can invent. You need to be thoughtful about how it could be accidentally or intentionally a problem. And so I think, again, the diversity of people in this room and the people you talk to intellectually is much higher than the corresponding group in a typical academic setting. And that's important because it means you're going to be thinking out of the box. You're going to be thinking out of the academic box. You're going to be thinking out of each other's boxes in a very important way, so you can see possible challenges and solutions to those challenges before anybody else even knows about the technology.
Amazing. Let's just open it up and get this discussion going with everybody. So we've got a couple of folks with microphones that are being passed around. So if you've got a question, raise your hand and we'll get this going. I see we start over here with Pete.
Hi, George. When you think about the idea of, say, having 7 billion people, each with a high-throughput sequencer on them, are there any upper limits to what the world can handle in terms of, like, physical limits in terms of what we can imagine usefully processing in terms of data observation, processing, management, and storage?
Yeah. So I'll give you a funny version of that first. I mean, people used to ask me, you know, if you're going to sequence 7 billion people, plus their microbiome and everything else, where are you going to store this? And I said, well, maybe we could store it in DNA, yeah, which is where it's already stored. I think the key is to start out with a high distillation, compression into meaningful things, and then as time goes by, that list will grow, but also our ability to process will grow. So, you know, right now you could argue we collect 6 billion base pairs of information from each of our genomes, but we're only interpreting maybe a couple hundred genes in a way that it is meaningful to you and your offspring. That is to say that they are highly predictive and medically actionable. And you basically ignore the rest. But it turns out it's more cost effective to collect all 6 billion base pairs in order to read out 100 genes than to just go in there and hand pick them. It's either cheaper and or more accurate, okay? And the same thing might go for a variety of environmental measurements that you collect all this stuff that's going through the wind, and the off chance that you pick up an Ebola, and then you only raise the flag when you see Ebola or Lassa or a new flu and so forth. So there's ways that you can embed in, let's say it's a little chip. I mean, you can put, in principle, millions of sequencing devices on a square centimeter. You can also put on there FPGAs and GPUs and things that will help you process that instantly, real time, into do we have an alert or not? Do we have something new or not? You can have a novelty detector.
Great. Next, in the front, Ryan.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to a couple points that you made earlier, where you were talking about how, one of the values of the citizen science is that people can, be critical and have those sort of critiques satisfied in some ways. And you were also talking about the value of this community in terms of, really imagining a lot of new applications of these technologies, and then, thinking about like how we make smart decisions about that. As someone who really, I think, sees very far with this, further than most in terms of the capabilities of these technologies, how are you making those decisions, and how can we develop structures for making good decisions about this type of thing, like gene drives and these kind of technologies? And because I feel like right now our structures for decision making aren't that developed.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think we need to appreciate the regulatory agencies that we have. So the USDA, the EPA, and the FDA weigh in on these things, and they're actually scalable. So the FDA doesn't have to get a new act of Congress in order to scale. They're charging money to everybody whose requests they process. So it's scalable. I think the other thing we need to do is we need to be very explicit about what would satisfy us. In other words, if we're going to be satisfied, we need to say, this is what the GMO community would have to do to satisfy. This is an example of evidence that we would accept, and have a big dialogue there, rather than just be in denial and say, there's no way you can satisfy me. You need to say, this is the kind of evidence of global warming. This is the kind of evidence that a gene drive is safe. This is the kind of evidence that the human genome is worth $1,000 for me in a lifetime expenditure. And just, rather than just say, I don't believe it, just say, this is what it would take for me to understand and believe it. And you don't have to understand all of science. I mean, you don't have to have 3 PhDs or even 1. You need to be clear about what would constitute proof. And also, hands-on, I think, would be a really great thing. I don't need to tell you guys about hands-on, but if you do an evolutionary experiment with your hands, it no longer becomes whether evolution exists or not. It's like, how useful is it in day-to-day life, right? That's a completely different discussion. And with global warming, if you do an experiment in your own hands where you get a cyanobacteria to fix carbon, it no longer becomes a question of who caused global warming. I mean, who cares? It's who's going to be the hero that saves us by reversing the carbon dioxide into usable plastics. So I think the hands-on helps people understand science in a way that no amount of K through 12 talking at you is going to do.
George, just to build on one thing you just said there. So you mentioned, kind of you don't need to have the 3 PhDs and so on. I think one thing that is true right now is that I think for either quote-unquote credibility reasons or so on, I think for people that are doing bio, PhDs and these types of advanced degrees are something, they are kind of an obstacle and a barrier for getting into certain aspects of biotech, whereas, and you don't see that in other disciplines, right? So what do you, what do you think is the kind of, you know, needs to be done so that those barriers start to dissipate?
Yeah, I think just ignore it. You know, I mean, one of the people who I learned biology, crystallography from was Jane Richardson. She had a master's degree in philosophy, but she got a MacArthur Award for her work in biocrystallography. You know, I think the important thing is to pick the things that you're passionate about and follow those passions, and that will make an impact on the world. I mean, certainly in business, there's a smaller barrier than there is in academia, and you know, you can collaborate with, you can have a pet PhD as a friend and collaborator, and that'll give you all the credibility you need and then some.
Well, again, I think probably this movement, we're building the tools and spaces so you don't need to get that PhD anymore, right? So I think that's a big part of it. Okay, where are the people with the microphones in their hands, actually? Okay. Can we, and one thing, when you ask your question, can you say your name as well and just who you are? Lena, I think you've got your... Yeah, please, yeah, go ahead. It is not on.
Who has a working microphone? There's some more here.
I know, it's okay.
We don't want to have too many in circulation.
Yeah.
Hello, I'm Lena. I have a training in design, and I'm from Japan. I have a question about the paper you wrote with Joe Davis on bioart. I think it's quite old, but from your perspective, what do you think the role of interdisciplinary is on the mindset, how it changes the mindset of the scientists working in the library, or how it affects the dynamics of the laboratory environment? Because I think a lot of people, at least within Europe, there's a lot of people pushing interdisciplinary without really thinking why they're doing it. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So I think interdisciplinary, or as Joy would say, antidisciplinary, is very important. It's very easy to get into a rut where you're working on smaller and smaller niches that become where you become so small you're the only person in the niche, and that's good for individuality, but it's not necessarily good for revolution and transformative efforts. Joe Davis is a perfect example of a artist and scientist who knows some deep things about black holes and writing DNA, and I credit him with essentially the first example of encoding digital art or digital anything into DNA in 1986, and was partial inspiration for us encoding books and images and movies into DNA decades later. And he's an embedded artist in my group. We have an embedded bioethicist. We've had law students and many others disciplines, and I think it's important to have that dialogue, both for safety and security reasons, but also creativity. By understanding where they're coming from, if they've met you more, and I would say Joe has met us more than halfway, you start questioning. You stop asking why and start asking why not. You start asking, you know, is something that seems artistic actually has a very practical arts component to it as well. So I think it's a terrific opportunity. And again, what better community do we have than this one to reach out? If you're not already an artist or a philosopher, ethicist, you've got one right next to you.
So just from a moderating perspective, anybody with a question that is on that theme of biodesign, art? Adam Zaretsky. Yeah, use the microphone, please.
George, it's good to see you. I'm saying hello. I had a question about aesthetics and interdisciplinary work with human embryos, even implantable, right? Pre-implantation human embryos getting sort of biohacked. And right now there is some oversight in some countries, embryo authorities, but how do they decide what's too artistic and therefore not for saving human lives or prolonging them but just sort of flip, pinstripe kind of stuff, or bad plaid. Even interspecies gross anatomy, right? I think we've talked about this before with the hooves, but I mean, if we're making germline interspecies gross anatomy cut and paste transplants, but actually so they're germline, so their kids will have hooves, and their kids will have hooves. If that's just art, is that still actually decent research to do, or to make, or to have as a kid?
I'm so glad that you're not a journalist asking me. You know, it's, so healthy humans are, hacking healthy humans is difficult to get approval. It's difficult to, you can cause trouble by not getting approval as well. You know, very often I encourage people to do civil disobedience. This is probably not one of those cases. But you can hack on yourself. Again, if you hurt yourself, then you can mess it up for everybody. So be very careful not to hurt yourself publicly. So you know, you know, for example, there's some of my friends who have done gene therapy on themselves in order to, in the two public cases for biorejuvenation. Fortunately, no harm that has happened, but that should be done with caution. There's a proper way of doing clinical testing. I know that you're talking about art, but let's just humor me for a moment. Clinical testing should be double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomized clinical trials. And anything short of that is you're wasting your time and maybe even a little money. And it's not that hard to scale up from doing it on yourself to doing it on, you know, you and a few friends, and then blinding it so you don't know who's getting it and who isn't. Now back to art, you know, I think you know, art is probably best done on simpler organisms. It's easier to do, and it's safer and it's going to less likely to backfire on the whole community if something goes wrong. And probably not do it on puppies and kittens either.
Okay, Nick, over here in the middle.
Hey, George. So this question is sort of a request for a call to action, because I've talked about this with David and some other people. I'm really proud and honored to be part of this community, and I really desperately want it to not die. So my question is, what would you like this community? What would you like this community to? What would you like to see this community achieve in the near future, long future?
That's a very tightly, you know, structured question with no open-endedness to it whatsoever.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. I would say start with curing diseases associated with poverty, and then curing poverty, possibly as a consequence, partial of that. Then you can move on to reversing aging and preparing us for space exploration, since our bodies are ill-prepared for microgravity and radiation and things like that. That's this year. Yeah.
That's by the end of the conference. Yeah.
I think we might even have on video.
Does anybody have a question connected to that theme at all? Okay. Bethan, over there in the back.
Hi. So I'm Bethan from London, from Bento Lab. So a couple of days ago, Joey Ito asked us if we thought that we were a movement yet. And what we see in the room is people that have come from all over the world, and often they may be the only national biohacker. And what you actually really need to get great projects done is a critical mass of people. And earlier on, kind of like in the earlier days of DIY Bio, there was so much funding going into studying biohackers, and so little going towards biohackers. And there were often You know, 5 sociologists to 1 biohacker. Makes sense. So my question for you is twofold. Firstly, how do we better hack funding so that funding comes towards our projects? So that the funding goes to more small-scale projects. And secondly, what are the challenges that you see as preventing everyone from being a biohacker? Is it technical? Is it hardware? Is it knowledge? Is it the cost of sequencing? What do you think is going to make that easier?
Okay, so hacking the money and what prevents us from becoming a movement, with everybody joining in. I think the two are somewhat related. I've been a force for radical cost reduction, which is counterintuitive both in industry and in academia. You don't do it because you don't get tenure for bringing down the price. And in an industry, you don't do it because you don't want to commoditize your cash cow. But nevertheless, we brought down the cost of sequencing about 3 million-fold and synthesis a similar amount. So one way of hacking the cost is bringing the cost down. I mean, you still have to pay for space, but maybe you could, there's a technological solution for that there where you can get it so you can hack, you know, without space. I mean, you could just go, you know, like you can skateboard in public, you can biohack in public, and you could kind of get together outside or inside randomly. I'm all for formalized spaces as well, but if we want everybody to do it, we need to make it portable and easy and fast feedback. Here's another example of hacking money. I mean, admittedly, the film might have 1,000 times the budget of the research, but it does help it get out to a lot of people, and a lot of people might say, hey, you know, I'm more talented than the people represented in that movie. I could do that, you know. Doesn't look that hard. And then they go out, and the wealth that comes from crowds is much bigger than you think. Think of sharing computers. Right now, you've got networks of personal computers which are more powerful than, you know, just one computer, one big computer. So if we can share that know-how, both our surveillance capabilities, our ingenuity, and even our space, each of us has a certain amount of personal space we can contribute to a collective.
Wonderful. Thomas.
Hi, George. Thanks for being here, and thank you, David, for making this possible. I have one question. George, thank you for recognizing the values and the potential of this community. I have one question for you. Since this community is really, you know, trying to think about what it could achieve in the future, and everybody's think about, you know, what kind of, thank you for this last question, Bethan, how to get actually resources in order to do this. Would you be able, or would you like actually to imagine a way to create shared research programs with this community?
Question is shared research programs. So in a way, we are doing that with Open Humans Foundation and Personal Genome Project. Those are very intentionally and aggressively open and shareable. In fact, it took quite a bit of social hacking to get to the point where we could convince institutional review boards and international groups in Canada and England and Austria and so forth to buy into this. But that is shareable. That represents it. Another one is this adgenes.org is a tremendous way of getting shareable resources at cost. As I understand it, it's a local company here that has the biggest UPS and FedEx budget of any company in Massachusetts, and it's a nonprofit. There are a few hacks like that are readily available.
Tomas, though, were you also talking about financial resources, or is it a?
Thank you. So what I was most interested in is to see if you, as a leader in biotechnology research and innovation, would you be able to hack your own budget and say, okay, let's open it to specific crowdsourced, like one question that you are personally interested in to move, biotech forward, would you see it actually being done not only within your own postdoc and researchers and professional scientist community, but also with this community?
Yeah, I think the best way to do that, so Addgene is an example. That's something where, we might patent CRISPR and have some major pharmaceuticals. We actually have 4 major pharmaceuticals right here in Cambridge. But then we hack out a piece of it so that it's free. I mean, so anybody can take the CRISPR from, I think 170 labs now are donated parts of the CRISPR technology, including mine. So anybody can do it at cost. And you can even replicate it from lab to lab, share it that way. So I think that's one way of carving out a piece that's very cost effective. The other thing we want to do, though, is enable you to get a return on your investment. You invest some time, we want you to be able to get it back. So one of the things is early adopters, early participants are going to be providing the tools, the shovels, essentially, to the gold rush, and providing ideas, and so the intellectual property of stories and narratives. That's one way to do it. You can also get corporate sponsor for meetings like this one. It's actually most corporations have some budget for that. They don't have a big. I have found through Hard Knocks, they don't have a big budget for just outright funding of institutions, especially nonprofits. It's much easier for me to get, $30 million from one of my buddies for a startup company that's half-baked than to get it for a fully baked nonprofit, $5.
Okay, who else? Let's do some in the front here. Arnav?
Hi, George. I'm Arnav. I've come all the way from India. My question is, bringing back the woolly mammoth your secret plan to stop the global warming?
It's a very poorly kept secret. So I think what it is, you can think of it as plausible, one of many solutions for global warming. I mean, I also am interested in the endangered species that it represents, but to some extent, we don't care about every endangered species. We care about the ones that can help us the most. And certainly the 1,400 gigatons of carbon dioxide trapped in the permafrost, plus another similar amount of methane trapped under the Arctic ice, is big. To put that in perspective, it is more than the combined of all the carbon in the atmosphere plus all the carbon in the rainforest put together, times 2. So anything you can do in that direction. Most of the strategies we have for dealing with global warming are slowing down the inevitable. And if we have even the possibility of a positive feedback loop that results in an exponential release of the carbon dioxide or methane by melting, that's something where our slow, incremental slowing down of the inevitable is going to be completely backfire. So we need a way of doing reversal, and we need to do it fast. So the elephant mammoth is performance art to get people attention to things like carbon sequestration with cyanobacteria, which is potentially scalable to a global level, and reversal. It's one of the few examples of reversal that's feasible.
Okay, thank you, Arnav and George. Okay, let's do Dan Hernandez over here. Oh, that's okay. Yeah, Jan, go ahead.
Oh, well, not Dan. I'm Jan Martin. Hi. A question along a bit of a different line. What question or direction is really exciting to you right now?
Well, I'm very excitable. So there are quite a few. I'm trying to think of things we haven't mentioned. So the transplantation from pigs into humans and solving the virus problem in that organism and many others. We're trying to make organisms that are resistant to all viruses by changing the genetic code. It's a very interesting hack because You can make an organism resistant to viruses you've never even characterized, things out in the wild that you know nothing about. But what you know, one thing about them, which is that all viruses depend on the genetic code of the host. And so if you can hack that, which we've done, we've now shown that by far the simplest, and I didn't even expect it would be powerful enough, change of one codon out of 64, the triplet codon, one in 64 was enough to make E. coli resistant to almost all the major classes of viruses. But then going on to 2 codons, that could really seal the deal. So I'm passionate about that. The BRAIN Initiative was something where just a handful of us, just 6 of us, made a proposal to the OSDP, a little white paper. This is something you guys could do as well. I don't think they checked our PhD at the OSDP, but they might have. And that resulted with just in a few months with Obama making an announcement that I love, because the acronym that his staff came up with had Innovative Neurotechnologies, BRAIN. And I said those 2 words, it just gave me goosebumps, because I think that is what's going to change the way we deal with brain research. Those are a few of top passions, but there are many others that we've mentioned already in this conversation.
Any questions from the Global South by chance? Actually, yeah, over here.
George, hi, I'm Abdul from Pakistan. In your book, Regenesis, you mentioned about mirroring the humans and molecules, right? To create a mirror image for resistance or something. So how long before you think how long it will take to achieve that stage?
Yeah, the how long questions are tough ones. I can tell you that probably the gene therapies at Editas might be 2 years from clinical trials, or the organs from pigs might be 2 years from clinical trials. Okay. Mirror humans, or long before we get to that, we're going to have mirror E. coli, and that looked pretty far away when I wrote the book. In fact, the whole point of talking about things far in advance is not is in case it arrives early, and so it is arriving early. I mean, for example, next-gen sequencing. When we first started talking about it, you could calculate by Moore's law, if you believe Moore's law, which is pretty aggressive, 6 decades. Instead, it was more like 6 years. So it's that experience that makes me want to talk about things that may look like they're 6 decades away, because they might only be six years. Keep in mind that CRISPR, which is pretty much now common breakfast table conversation all over the place, is not just CRISPR like cereal, but CRISPR technology is only 4 years old as a technology. So with the mirror life, we've tried chemical approaches, organic chemistry, biochemistry, and now biology. And the third looks pretty promising. Variations on what I talked about, changing genetic code. You can change genetic code so that it has a bunch of new code for D-amino acids. It would take me much longer to really go into that, but it's looking promising. And we have a couple of papers coming out.
Well, if we're solving global poverty before the end of the year, I think we can probably handle that by the end of the conference. So we're on our way. Dan Hernandez over in the back.
Hi, George. So I became associated to the How to Grow Almost Anything course this year, and I think this course has the potential to capture the imaginations and passions of people all around the world, like it has to myself. And so I wanted to ask you, this course as a potentially extremely powerful vehicle to get exciting projects, world-changing applications of synthetic biology and DIY bio, funneled through this powerful network that is decentralized. And so to ask you, what do you see for this course? What is the potential for the course? And what are you doing to personally make it happen?
Oh, First of all, I have to have a call out and thanks to Neil Gershenfeld here for starting How to Make Almost Anything and engaging me in that community since very early days. That certainly has been an inspiration, not to mention the whole DIY bio community. You know, what I'm doing personally is I'm working with David to craft a curriculum each year, making it more awesome than the previous year. This year, I think the main thing was to have an experimental, I mean, it was experimental all 3 years, but to have an experimental thread that would go all the way through it, where you build on previous classes and it's all integrated. And I think having a theme like that and enabling work, you know, figuring out ways that we can take the maker ethos and the ability to make devices and integrate them with biology is very powerful as well.
So why don't we pass the mic over to Gunther? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Günther from Austria. I have a question. Do you see, is there a danger when we go back to the global warming problem that some of these inventions would like back bad habits? For example, if there would be a solution like to just to pause the 20 major cruise ships from going out in the sea just for a year or two, it would have like a very fast impact on global warming. For example, so if you come up with a solution that maybe binds all the carbon dioxide, so nobody would think that we should stop firing like the worst petroleum in big ships, for example.
Yeah, I'm big on activism, and that's part of the agenda there. But I also think that that request for sacrifice, that iteration insistence that it is an inconvenient truth, is actually part of the polarization of the discussion. It's part of the reason for denial. If I say, you that own industry are and you that are being entertained are responsible for global warming, then I cause you to be in denial. I do not recruit you to our cause. I alienate you, and I like it. I love it. But the alternative is to say, whether or not it's your fault, it's your opportunity to do something about it, to reverse it. If an asteroid were aiming towards the planet, we would not say, is Monsanto responsible for that asteroid? You know, we would say, who's the hero who's going to stop that asteroid? And that's essentially what we have now. It doesn't matter who caused global warming. It's how can we solve it? And what worries me about stopping the cruise ships or stopping the televised football programs or stopping the SUVs or giving up beef, which is like 23 times more wasteful than corn or soybeans. What about, you know, what happens if we have a positive feedback loop where if everybody just left the planet, stopped wasting making carbon dioxide, we might still go into global warming because of a cycle that's already going where you get melting, release of methane, more melting, more release of methane. I worry about that scenario. You can put your own probabilities on it, but we need to have a reversal strategy, in my opinion.
No, I understand that argument, but I just brought up the example for a holiday cruise ship. So it would be a tiny spectrum of all human beings, of all 6 billion people, and a lot of human beings don't have a holiday in maybe 10 years. So it would be just like every second year, maybe a small amount of people wouldn't go on a cruise holiday. So they could go hiking in the mountains, you know, or do something else, or even drive their SUVs, because so it would only affect a very small group of people, you know, going on cruises.
And it would only have a very small impact. I mean, like I say, I'm totally enthusiastic about that. For the people that are already like leaning in that direction, they're going to go for it. And if nothing else, it'll be performance art to get us excited about the problem, and we can start asking, well, how big an impact is that? Is that enough to save us the 1,400 gigatons of carbon that's going up in the air that's not human, that's not anthropogenic? But I think it's great for people to educate people in everyday life, in K through 12. They come home to their parents and they say, gee, you know, why are we doing this and that wasteful activity? And that's great, because that's part of the education process. So, yes, plus plus.
Oh, wow, all these hands are submerged. Let's do in the front over here. And we'll just keep going for, I know we're supposed to stop around 12, but we'll just keep going longer.
It's an unconference.
Yeah.
Thank you, George. I have a question. So when you're doing encode digital information in the DNA, what kind of future you envision in your mind at the moment? As I know, some top scientists, they said they do some experiments. There's a kind of, they probably see more things than the rest. So I want to see what kind of vision in your mind at the moment about the future, next 20, 10, 20 years, even later.
So as I make sure I got the question, next 10 or 20 years having to do with encoding information into DNA, is that? Yeah. Yeah. So, and what did that look like in 2012 when we encoded my book into DNA? You know, it was a very specific niche that I was looking for, which is archival storage, and it's not something that I didn't fully appreciate until after I mean, I partially did, but when I published it, suddenly all the archivists of the world were at my doorstep saying, oh, we have a much bigger problem than you ever imagined, archiving information, movies, and so forth. Every few years they have to change formats, back up, and so forth. And many, many precious artistic and other documents have been destroyed, lost forever. So that was one component. It was the archival storage. This is not replacing your thumb drive on your or your disk drive on your computer. The other component, though, is so it has the advantage that it's 1 million times smaller. It's long-lived. You know, the record for DNA is 700,000 years, while the record for disk drives is a little less than that. But then the other part is it might naturally interface with biological systems. So you can make like you have a black box in your airplane. In case it goes down, you have a black box in your bodies or in the bodies of anything agricultural or environmental, so that if something goes wrong, you can go back and figure out what happened because you've been recording it from time into DNA. And then there's something that's a hybrid between those two, between archiving information and interfacing with biological systems, neural systems. Something in between is you could cut out all the electronics and mechanical engineering and have biological systems that do the recording. So skip the digital component, go straight from the analog vision, you know, like I'm currently seeing you, that means that there's information on my retina. We could record that into DNA and make that something that's essentially where the cost of the instrument, the cost of the video recorder is free because they're essentially the same way that the forest and the insects in the forest are free.
Another question is so if this information going to mutate and change because it's it's in the biological form? Yeah.
Well, so the question is, will the information mutate and change? So the thing that I made in 2012 is not in a living cell, it's in a frozen state. It still is mutated. I mean, people think frozen is safe. Even at liquid nitrogen, you still have cosmic rays penetrating and hitting, but you have lots of backup copies. So we made 70 billion copies of my book, which is pretty decent level of backup. And so, but in a biological system, again, if you have a redundancy, mutation is okay. But for archiving, probably your best bet is to have both redundancy and a non-replicating system, or a very slowly replicating system.
Okay, thank you.
Right behind you. Yeah, there you go.
Hello, this is Daniel from Mexico. In your opinion, which is the most important challenge for biotechnology now that we have the most stupid president in the US history?
Well, so interestingly, I actually think that science survives idiocy. In fact, and I'm not picking on any particular person or leader here. You know, political leadership, kind of the height of, I'm going to be a little exaggerated here, the height of political leadership is either killing 30 million people or stopping somebody from killing 30 million people. So you know you have Mao Zedong and Stalin and Hitler and so forth, and then you've got all the heroes that stop them. But the real revolutions, the things that allowed 3 billion people to survive, like the Green Revolution, wasn't really political, it was scientific. And it survived as long as there is diversity of government systems. You know, while the Soviet Union is in denial of genetics with Lysenko and so forth, another part of the world is going gung-ho on genetics. While one set of countries thinks GMOs are going to kill you, another set thinks they're going to save us. And so that diversity is why we have survival. Now what happened, the consequence for a local is bigger than global. So locally, in the Axis powers before World War II, Italy and Germany and Poland were losing the top scientists, the future Nobel Prize winners and the future leaders of the American and British revolution in industry, the physicists and the chemists, they left in droves. The same thing could happen to no government is immune to the possibility of scientists moving to where they're appreciated. And not to say anything negative about the United States, in China, they have a government where 80% of their politicians have a degree in science or engineering. You can look up what our record is. It's less than 1%. So if there's a brain drain, it's because we don't appreciate them. And it makes perfect sense that you should go where you're appreciated.
Okay, so since we're over time, can everybody who has a question last, can you keep your hand raised? So we've got 1, 2, oh my God, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, we have 10 questions left. All right, so let's do this. Keep your hand raised, keep your hand raised. So maybe we'll do like 5 rapid fire, just ask the questions, and then we can rapid fire answer, try a high throughput question answer, and then so let's do from from Isaac to the left, like this group of, let's just ask the question quickly, and then George will try to answer them quickly. So.
I should do this blindfold. This would be like, like chess, right? Yeah.
Okay, Isaac, go.
Yeah, I'm going to do it in Pig Latin also, just to add a layer of complexity. So a lot of our labs do have public-facing events. We kind of are an interface to the public in a lot of ways for this technology. And what we do, I think, scares a lot of people. The general public, it's quite a scary thing. So I'm just curious if you have any just general advice for us on how we can craft a narrative or communicate when we're talking to somebody who probably doesn't have a lot of knowledge about it, but is quite fearful of it.
Okay, so that's good. So how do we properly communicate to reduce fear?
So Elon Musk said that artificial intelligence is more likely to destroy the world than North Korea. Now, I'm not Elon Musk, but I'll play the devil's advocate. Is biotechnology it has more potential to destroy the world than North Korea? And I want the answers that other people gave to Elon Musk to say that this is not true.
Let's just do those two. They're kind of coupled together, so yeah.
They're related. So one thing that I do I communicate quite a bit about scary scenarios, not to increase the scare level, nor to reassure. I think it's important not to just say, not get a reputation for just reassuring. It's to take it seriously, listen carefully, and think creatively about things that could mitigate and reduce the scare factor. A lot of decision making is made. Some people argue all decision making is made by your gut, and the rational part of your brain is rationalization of those gut feelings. That should be taken seriously as well. It's very powerful. You need to convincingly present the benefits versus risks. For some things, if the benefits are very low, for example, GM foods, no risk level is acceptable. And I have to sympathize with the critics of GM foods, even if it doesn't cause any harm. Why take the risk? But with GM medicines, there's a very high benefit, and so there's relatively less discussion of the very considerable, they are demonstrated risks of sticking pharmaceuticals into your body, whether they're GM or not. In terms of Elon, I know him, and you can find a 2-day where I lectured for almost 2 days at his shop online. I mean, there's an online record of that. He's mostly complaining about AI, not biotech. And again, I don't want to be reassuring. He gave us meaning Future Life Institute, Max Tegmark, $10 million to try to engage the AI community, because they had been mostly wanting to shut up the discussion of AI risk reasonably. You know, I think what's better than denial on either side, saying it's not a risk or it is a risk, you can have denialists on both sides, is to say, what would we do hypothetically if it were a risk? You know, talk about the solutions, and that's what the $10 million went to, is a granting program where you would imagine the risk and the solutions. And it results in a much more interesting conversation. If you just focus on the risk, or just focus on the benefits, you're not creative about possible solutions. And I personally think that the risk, so relative to North Korea, I mean, I think North Korea is a huge risk to Seoul, Korea. You know, 23 million souls are at risk of ordinary artillery, don't even need nuclear bombs. And that'd be a huge tragedy. And I think, and if it becomes from a lack of communication skills, that would be really horrible. I mean, essentially one artillery blast, you could do as much damage as World War II. So, and it's partly because we have this incredible concentration of people in cities, which is otherwise a pretty good idea. They're very cost effective and so forth. You know, I don't, you know, but that is not to say that biotech couldn't produce something that is risky, but I think it behooves us to constantly be thinking ahead on unintended consequences and having conversations about that.
Okay, so the final three on this side.
Yeah, I have a comment that involves risk and consequences with this open access kind of thing. Your personal gathering information systems and a high throughput system is a perfect device for the FBI to also plant a chip on there. And so we have this open access, but I'm also wondering, do we have an open result? Who owns the result, and what's the danger of surveillance in this methodology? And are you designing in your system a counter to these aspects? This is a risk question of that.
Shall I answer that, or?
Yeah, let's just go for it, yeah.
So in the Personal Genome Project, that's intentionally, we're not tracking what it's used for. We're inviting people to say what they use it for, but it's like Wikipedia. There's no tracking of what you use Wikipedia for. So, but I think there's a whole nother community question, which is whether or not you're sharing your data intentionally, who's getting access to it, and something that people don't necessarily fully realize is that people will hack and get your credit card information, or they'll get your medical records. Your medical records are worth, as I understand it, 20 times as much as your credit card information, because your credit card information is ephemeral. It disappears the instant you notice that it's gone or it's been hacked, while your medical information contains permanent information that is, for bad reasons, used as identifying information, like, you know, your names of your parents, your social security number, all kinds of things that shouldn't be used as identification, but they are. Anyway, there's a big hacker community out there that's getting access to your medical records, or Equifax is another thing. And so it's very hard to track that. I mean, I'm sure lots of people would like to be able to track that and change that. I don't have a particular solution other than destigmatization, which is what you do is, rather than trying to protect your information and build bigger and bigger walls, you say, why is it that we're protecting it? It's because people are going to take away something if I have a genetic disease like narcolepsy or dyslexia, which I happen to have both. You destigmatize it. When I was young, it used to be if you had cancer or psychiatric disorders or sexual dysfunction or sexual preferences that were different from the norm, you did not talk about that. You didn't talk about it to anybody, even your friends and family. Now, all of those things are talked about pretty readily, partly because we have, you know, technology is relevant, but in many cases, it's just the conversation has changed. And so you can no longer extort money from people because you know that they have cancer or that you know that they're gay or that sort of thing. It's much, much harder to do extortion or other discrimination than it used to be. Not impossible. So I think that's the direction, is to get rid of, and then why would it, so all my information or a lot of my medical information is online because of the Personal Genome Project. I was volunteer #1 by the request of the IRB. People can't really use that against me because everybody knows it. Everybody knows I flunked out of graduate school because the letter is on my webpage, you know. So destigmatization. It's not easy, but it's a lot easier than figuring out how to stop hackers.
All right, so I think we have 7 more questions. So can we try to ask the questions with more concision? And George will also go more quickly in his answer. Pat, no, we're just finishing up this side. Pat, go ahead.
Hi. Hello. Yes, hello, George. I'm Pat from Thailand. I have 2 questions. First one is very simple. You have a plan to bring back mammoth. Do you have a plan to bring back dinosaur? The second question is, you know, like I work in AI, and you know we have smarter AI. We have systems that connect, you know, computer together. We have systems that connect people together. What is our next frontier then? You know, we have all this technology. What is beyond this, and what is our limit?
Okay, I'm gonna try to be fast. So yes, on the dinosaur, although it's starting with ostrich, and then. But it doesn't have as compelling an argument. It doesn't really have the, you know, the connection to saving the tundra. But work with us on this, okay? And the other one was AI. So I think that AI is heavily silicon-based. I think we can have another AI, maybe call it NI or HI or something, where we're hacking biological systems that compute very well. Already the most powerful supercomputer on the planet is here. It's 20 watts rather than 100 kilowatts. It can do pretty well. It can lose gracefully Jeopardy while thinking great thoughts like you know, Einstein's Annum Mirabilis.
Great. And then Haoshen?
Thanks, George. As you know, as we all know, that you have a team of like artists and bioethics and all together, and so it's a very interdisciplinary, diverse group. And I just wonder, how do you keep the attitude towards the group while they're in discussion, and inclusive attitude towards each other, so that all the opinions from each side will be accepted? Like, I guess this is really important, as you formerly mentioned about destigmatization and communication problems.
Well, so, I mean, first of all, we're not aiming for consensus necessarily within my group or with the outside world. Diversity is a really good thing, diversity of opinion. Failure is an option. So the motto of NASA for a while was failure is not an option. Failure definitely is an option. Has to be maybe not totally celebrated, but at least a acceptable part of if you're not failing, you're not trying. But I think the most important thing is to not be dismissive. So if an idea comes up and it looks currently difficult, you don't use words like impossible or unaffordable or, you know, ridiculous. You don't throw it in the trash can. You put it up on the wall and say, here's a grand challenge. You know, it's a much more positive way of looking at things that are out of reach. And we know that we now have a track record of grand challenges that appear way, way faster than you ever thought.
Tina.
Hi, so does this work?
Yeah, well, Tina, go ahead.
Hello,
yeah.
hello? Thank you, George. So there's like regions in the world that we have like low resource settings, but we're very passionate about like making solutions with biological systems. Sometimes we're like undergrads and stuff. So could you help us to like get more know-how for a leap forward towards making these solutions? Because like there's like a lot of human resources that I think that are not harnessed, given like the technological gap, and yeah.
Well, so another big question, but the short answer, there are organizations like Do-It-Yourself Biology and Biohacker Spaces, and iGEM is a really good example for undergraduate, and you said undergraduate, where you encourage good practices, ethical, but also very creative solutions, where at the end, most of the iGEM projects haven't really accomplished their goals, but they've done it with such panache and such flair, you know, that you have to get excited about it. And I think each iGEM project creates a cloud of enthusiasm around it.
Yeah, but that's what we were talking about yesterday, that there's like many universities, for example, that cannot afford like an iGEM project, you know? So the question is more like for like low resource settings, you know, like Africa, Latin America.
Yeah,
So
I didn't mean literally iGEM team where you fly out to the annual meeting, but an iGEM inspired team where you just put together whatever resources you have and you think creatively about what you have. And I actually believe that, and I've seen many examples where even in my own lab where resource limited results in higher creativity than when you have too much resources. I know many of my colleagues, I won't name names, have way too much money, and they're wasting it. You probably know what I'm talking about.
Okay, yeah, Tina.
Hi, so I wanted to kind of get your take and hone in on what I consider to be one of the themes of this conference, which is how do community labs fit into this tapestry of science and society? And so clearly we don't have the money advantage, we don't have the facilities and space advantage, but what we do have is an eclectic group of people with like various diverse experiences and skill sets. And so I'm wondering, what can community labs do that you feel academic labs or industry labs can't? And how can community labs push the envelope on the society side and the science side?
Yeah, I mean, somehow it seems like the answer is embedded in your question. You know, they are eclectic. Eclectic is partially an end in itself, and it is the solution to most of our problems. And the thinking out of the box can really come from anywhere. I mean, we've seen many examples of, you know, a patent clerk who in 1905 changed the world in 5 different ways. The key thing is ideas. So even if the experiment you do, you know, involves, you know, grinding up vegetables, the impact it has if your narrative is compelling is get out there and blog on it or Twitter, and it will catch, if there's something to it, there's nothing stopping your ideas from going viral. I mean, it's just the idea itself, and who knows where it's going to come from. It's much more likely that people are going to be attracted to it if it came from modest origins than if it came from some, you know, stainless steel overpaid lab.
Right next, yeah. Tina, can you pass the mic over? Yeah.
So my question is basically, so I spent like a summer trying to replicate this Argonaut DNA editing system that was published in Nature Biotechnology, and it, you know, a lot of the techniques that I learned on YouTube, so I wasn't sure if it was me or should I doubt something published in a, you know, publication like Nature. So is there like a way of getting around that, or is
well, yeah, so I mean, certainly Nature does have a few examples where it was incorrect. You know, scotophobin, infinite dilution experiments, cold fusion, the STAP, stem cell protocol, and now Argonaut. So you definitely shouldn't accept it blindly. One thing to do is to wait until 2 labs have done it, independent of one another. That still can be cutting edge. It's not like you're waiting until it's a decade old. You're just waiting for the second lab to confirm it.
And by the way, I think that's something we've talked about as a potential role for this network of laboratories
Absolutely,
too, is reproducibility.
Something that's wholly underappreciated in the National Institutes of Health granting is reproducing previous results and making them more robust. So if you can get it so that it works in community science, it really works. And the translation from the, let's say, the second Nature paper to community is still a lot of work, but it's the kind of work that you can do on a relatively low budget for some of these things. So that's the other thing, is not only wait for it to be reproduced, but wait until you can see the way to make it cost effective. I mean, it doesn't have to already be reduced to that, but you need to see it.
Okay, just last couple questions. Yeah, Winnie.
Can you hear me? All right. So the discussion so far points to many uncertainties, like is it going to be 60 or 6 years? Is the future exciting or scary? So what I ask myself is, are we producing the people who are equipped with the right social, technological, and ethical capabilities to deal with these things? So my question is, what do you think about our educational system, like from, say, 12 years old upwards?
Yeah, it's a terrible system. But it's like democracy. It's a terrible political system, but it's the best we got. You know, I trust our ability to train the next generation more than I trust our ability to train silicon. I think eventually we might be able to figure out what we mean when we say, be a good boy and girl. You know, that kind of vague infrastructure doesn't work for a drone. You can't just vaguely say, do no harm. But human-to-human communication does have that nature. They kind of get it because they're humans. And there's a lot of instinct and culture that is easily transmitted. So that's the good part of it. Some people speculate that we should be genetically engineering ourselves to be more ethical. I think that's dangerous, but it's interesting conversation. Certainly there are exceptional people who are extremely ethical and extremely unethical, some of it by birth. I mean, sociopathy probably has some congenital components to it that we need to be cautious of, but not necessarily, we don't necessarily want to engineer it out of the species. I mean, it's too early to be doing that kind of conversation. I don't know if that's where you were going with this, but I think the main thing is, you know, the education could be improved. Stop teaching to the test and the facts. Start teaching to how we know what we know, how we can prove that something is true or false, rather than just whoever shouts the loudest that everybody else is fake.
Thank you.
Okay, I guess maybe just the last one over here then, Elliot.
Hello? Oh. My name's Elliot, and I help people grow cyanobacteria for nutrition, so I really appreciate a lot of your comments about that. I have a really good ending question, I think. Do you think you're going to live forever? And if so, how? And if not, what do you want your legacy to be?
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a good ending question. Thank you, everybody. No. I have no idea. I mean, it's really not about me. It's about, is anybody in this room going to live for a very long time? And I think forever is, you know, there's heat death of the universe and stuff like that. That's kind of, it may be negotiable as well. You know, I think there's a very good chance that we will increase. We've been improving longevity by about 1 year per 4 years, and we need to get it to 1 year per year to break even. And yeah, I think there's a chance that it will accelerate. I've seen some things change slope. That particular slope is pretty constant for 170 years, so it sort of seems like a law. But I mean, the lesson I learned from Moore's law is it's not really a law, at least for biology. So that's possible. You know, in terms of legacy, I mean, I think that these are truly revolutionary times. You know, sometimes I feel like we're you know, these exponentials were not the things we talked about or knew about when I was a child. And so there's very likely that just by coincidence that we are alive and close to the exponential and to some extent helping it grow exponentially and guiding it to where it's a safe exponential means that just by being there, we're part of that legacy. So, you know, I think all of you are in the right place at the right time for responsible conduct of exponential science.
And so maybe George, just to connect with that point you just made, any final comments, words of advice for, or anything else you want to say to this global group?
Well, shorter is better. I mean, thank you for sharing, and please feel free to contact me. Some people feel like I have no time. I actually do have a little bit of time, so if you have something that you want to share, feel free. Thank you.
Okay, George, thank you so much. Now, actually, don't go anywhere quite yet. So what we're going to do is, so Neil Gershenfeld was in the room. We originally were going to have Neil come on stage and just you two are going to chat for just a couple of minutes about the kind of connection between DIY, between the Fab Lab movement, maker movement, and kind of what's happening in bio. I think Neil might have had to leave, but just to say, George is going to be here the whole rest of the day, all the way with us until 6, so he's going to be hanging out and joining various unconferences. And so the game plan was, I hope to find Neil, but from between 4 and 5 p.m. before the closing session, we were going to have a session on Fab Labs making biolabs, Fab Labs maker movement, connecting with biomaker movement. So that still hopefully will happen. And yeah, and George will be here for the rest of the day. And what we're going to do now, okay, just to bring it all home. I know lunch is outside, but since we've got everybody here, I think this is the perfect moment to just have our last Hello World session. So we've just got like 5 people that are going to present some slides. So Peter, if we can cue up Hello World Part 3. After we do Hello World, again, we've got the whole crew here. We're all going to go into the lysosome, and we're going to take a family photo together. Okay, and then we're gonna have lunch together. I'm just sorry because lunch got crammed. Have lunch with the breakout sessions, the unconference at 1 p.m. Okay, well, so you'll eat lunch while you unconference if that's cool. And George, we've just been doing this every single morning where everybody comes on stage for a minute and introduces themselves. And so we can get off the stage so that the people who are supposed to be on the stage can come and do it. But let's do Hello World Part 3 and close this out. So I don't know what the order is for people, so I hope you all know what the order is. And let's just get started. So I think I have the clicker, actually. So I'm going to click, and I'm going to pass the slide to you.
So hi, my name is Abdul Hadi, and I'm from Pakistan. I own the first community biolab of Pakistan. It's called AbroBios, and we started out in March, so it's been around 6 to 7 months. We're relatively young compared to all of you seasoned people. We work on kind of different projects ranging from hardware to pure genetics to different stuff like lab on chips and other stuff as well, right? We are highly invested in education and policy making. So that's kind of our main aspect. We are looking for open collaborations. So if any of you would like to work on the projects listed over here, like, please get in contact. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, hello there. I'm Hao Xin, and I'm from Taiwan, and we have an art and culture space located at Taipei. So we are like, we cover some aspects of biohacking and DIY bio, but we also have a focus on bio art and design and civil technology, as well as government transparency. And also we have a heavy emphasis on LGBTQ discussions, like that will go on, like, for example, of transgender or trans species, or like all the things that are more or less related to body body politics or to biopolitics. So that is something that we are working on at the moment. We've been initialized since like 2012, and so it's still going on. It would be great to have you guys there, and we hope we will establish a connection to